Humans have invented some truly monstrous ways to kill one another, but few are as gut-wrenchingly awful as being sawn in half. It's a punishment that feels like it belongs in mythology or the deepest circle of hell, not in the pages of our own history. The image alone, a long, two-man saw working its way through a living person, is pure nightmare fuel. For centuries, this punishment has been wrapped in a particularly gruesome legend. The story goes that executioners weren't just killing someone. They were performing a cold, calculated procedure designed for maximum suffering. They'd hang the condemned upside down, letting gravity pool all the blood in their head. This, the legend claims, was a masterclass in cruelty, a way to use the body's own functions against itself, keeping the brain oxygenated and the victim hideously conscious for every single agonizing second. But is that story true? Was this a real technique, a piece of applied anatomical terror passed from one executioner to the next? Or is the reality of this punishment something far different, and in some ways, even more disturbing? The truth is buried under layers of propaganda, medical reality, and the incredible power of fear itself. It's time to separate the bloody legend from the even bloodier facts. Let's start with the legend that gives this punishment its spine-chilling reputation. The theory, as it's usually told, is as simple as it is evil. Hang someone upside down, and gravity does the rest. Blood, instead of draining from the head and causing a quick blackout, is forced downwards, keeping the brain flush with oxygen. It turns the body's survival instincts into an instrument of torture, guaranteeing that the mind has a front-row seat to its own grisly destruction. The story says the executioners could start the saw at the groin and take their time, with the victim wide awake to feel the blade tear through flesh, sever muscle, and grind against bone. Consciousness, they say, would only fade as the saw finally clawed its way toward the chest. It's a terrifyingly neat explanation, and you'll find it repeated in books, documentaries, and all over the internet. It paints a picture of methodical, intelligent cruelty. There's just one big problem with it. Basic biology says it's almost certainly not true. From a modern medical standpoint, the idea that hanging upside down would keep you conscious during a vertical sawing is deeply flawed. The real killer in this scenario isn't gravity, it's catastrophic blood loss, known as hemorrhagic shock. The human body is a pressurized system. The moment you start sawing a person from the groin upwards, you're going to sever some of the biggest blood vessels in the body, the femoral arteries in the thighs and the iliac arteries in the pelvis. These aren't tiny vessels. They're major pipelines. Once they're cut, the victim would start bleeding out at a shocking rate. The body only holds about 5 liters of blood. Losing just 1.5 to 2 liters is enough to send someone into severe shock. At that point, blood pressure plummets. The heart starts beating frantically but weakly, and the brain is starved of oxygen. The result isn't prolonged awareness, but a fast spiral into confusion, unconsciousness, and death, likely within minutes. Being upside down wouldn't prevent this. While it might give you a temporary head rush, it can't defy the basic physics of a leaky container. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a giant hole in the bottom. The loss will always be faster than the supply. The brain is incredibly sensitive to a lack of oxygen. Without enough blood pressure to keep it fed, consciousness is one of the very first things to go. The claim that a victim would be lucid until the saw hit their navel is medically unbelievable. Death from shock and blood loss would get there much, much sooner. So if the technique doesn't actually work, where did the story come from? The truth is, the idea of it was far more important than the reality. The sawing execution wasn't about a clever physiological trick-hour. The truth of the punishment was brutal, but the myth was its real weapon. It was about creating a legend. It was a story designed to be told, to spread terror, and to serve as the ultimate symbol of absolute, inescapable P. To understand death by sawing, you have to wade through a sea of questionable sources, spooky stories, and outright propaganda. The punishment is famous not because it was common, but because it shows up in some of history's most sensational tales. Take ancient Persia. The Greek historian Ctesias wrote that the ruthless Queen Persides ordered a man to be sawn in half. The problem? Modern historians generally see Ctesias as an unreliable narrator, more interested in scandalous stories than in facts. His accounts are full of palace drama and gruesome details that were likely exaggerated to entertain his Greek audience and make the Persian court look cruel and corrupt. the Romans get roped in too. The historian Suetonius, known for his juicy and often gossipy biographies of the emperors, claimed that Caligula had prisoners sawn in half at his dinner parties as an appetizer for the main course. But again, the source is shaky. Suetonius was writing decades after Caligula died and loved repeating the most lurid rumors he could find. There's no solid evidence this was a regular practice. And when other Roman sources do mention sawing, they often describe a transverse cut across the middle, more like a waist chopping, not the iconic vertical sawing. But perhaps the most famous association is with the Spanish Inquisition. You've probably seen the old woodcuts from the 16th and 17th centuries, usually printed in Protestant countries, showing Spanish friars coolly observing the sawing of heretics. These images were incredibly effective propaganda. They were a key part of the Black Legend, a smear campaign by Spain's enemies, like England and the Dutch Republic, to paint the Spanish Empire as uniquely barbaric and evil. The engravings showed Spaniards feeding babies to dogs, burning people alive, and, of course, sawing them in half. The reality is that modern historians who've studied the actual archives of the Inquisition have found no real evidence that sawing was an official method of punishment. The Inquisition was brutal. They used torture and executed people, usually by garrote and burning. But the saw appears to have been a propaganda tool, an imagined horror added by Spain's enemies to demonize the entire nation and its church. You see the same pattern in stories about the Ottoman Empire. Tales spread through Europe claiming Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror had hundreds of people sawn in half. But these accounts mostly come from hostile European sources, not reliable Ottoman records. In almost every famous case, death by sawing exists more as a powerful story than a common practice. It was a tale told by enemies, a symbol of ultimate cruelty whose reputation far outstripped its actual use. While many of the most famous stories are probably myths, that doesn't mean this horrific punishment never happened. The evidence suggests that death by sawing was exceptionally rare, but it does seem to appear in a few historical records, usually tied to moments of extreme political or religious conflict. One of the most powerful accounts comes from Sikh history. In 1675, a devout Sikh named Bhimati Das was executed in Delhi on the orders of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. He had been arrested for resisting the forced conversion of Hindu pundits to Islam. When given the choice to convert or die, Bhimati Das refused to abandon his faith. According to Sikh tradition, his execution was performed with chilling purpose. He was asked for his final wish, and he asked to be facing his guru as he died. He was then bound between two posts, and a saw was placed on his head and drawn downwards. Sikh accounts say that he remained calm, reciting the sacred Japji Sahib prayer as he was sawn in two. This event is a cornerstone of Sikh martyrdom, a profound story of faith and sacrifice. While the story is deeply revered in Sikh tradition, it's worth noting that detailed, neutral records from the Mughal court are scarce, so the account is preserved and honored primarily within Sikhism itself. Elsewhere, there were different, but equally grim, methods of bisection. In Imperial China, a punishment called Yao Zhan, or waist chop, was used. This wasn't vertical sawing. Instead, the person was sliced in half horizontally with a massive blade. Because the vital organs are in the upper body, victims might have remained conscious for a few horrifying moments as they bled to death. There's a famous, though probably embellished, story of a scholar who, after being waist chopped, used his own blood to write the character for a usurper on the ground before he died. Outside of these contexts, documented cases of vertical sawing in Europe are incredibly few and far between. When it did happen, it was typically reserved for the most heinous crimes against the state, like high treason. Its rarity was the key to its power. This wasn't a punishment for a common thief. It was a horrifying spectacle of state power, a nightmare brought to life to send an unforgettable message. The propaganda woodcuts may not have been accurate, but they were based on a terrifying kernel of truth, that a government, pushed to its limit, was capable of this. So let's strip away the myth and look at this clinically. What would actually happen to a human body being sawn in half from the groin up? The reality is a timeline of trauma, pain, and systemic collapse that is brutal, but also mercifully faster than the legends claim. First, you're hung upside down. The immediate sensation is a disorienting rush of blood to the head, causing immense pressure and a pounding headache. Your world is literally turned upside down, a state of total helplessness. Then, they bring the saw. It's a big, two-man rip saw made for cutting wood. The first pull of its coarse teeth across your skin would be agonizing. But pain is just the start of the body's catastrophic failure. A saw doesn't slice, it rips and tears. As it moves deeper, it shreds skin, fat, and muscle, sending signals of unbelievable agony to the brain. But the point of no return arrives very, very quickly. As the saw grinds through the pelvis, it hits the femoral arteries and the even larger iliac arteries. The moment those major vessels are torn open, a timer starts, and it ticks incredibly fast. This triggers massive hemorrhagic shock. Blood pressure doesn't just drop, it crashes. The heart, sensing the pressure loss, starts beating wildly, trying to pump blood that's now pouring out of the body. Breathing becomes rapid and shallow. The brain, even though it's getting plenty of blood from gravity, is starved of blood pressure. Without that pressure, oxygen can't get into the brain tissue. Confusion and dizziness would set in almost right away, followed by dimming vision and unconsciousness. This isn't a long, lucid journey of pain. It's a rapid, chaotic shutdown. The victim would likely be unconscious within 2 to 3 minutes after the major arteries were severed. The horror isn't being awake for half an hour. It's the unimaginable agony and terror packed into those first 1 or 2 conscious minutes. So, the idea of a victim staying conscious long enough to watch the saw reach their navel? It's pure horror fiction. By the time the saw had worked its way through the dense bone of the pelvis, a slow process in itself, the victim would have long since died from shock. The real mechanics are a story of brutal, overwhelming trauma, not some clever trick. The horror is raw and primitive. The sound of the saw on bone, the intense pain, and the swift, terrifying realization that your body is failing. If prolonged consciousness was a myth and the execution was a messy and relatively brief affair, then why does death by sawing have such a powerful grip on our imagination? What was the real point? The answer is that the execution was never just about killing one person. It was an act of psychological warfare against everyone. Its real power wasn't in the act, but in the story it created. First, it was the ultimate public spectacle. Executions used to be public festivals, designed to show everyone who was in charge. A hanging was routine, but sawing a person in half, that was theater. It was so visually extreme, so fundamentally shocking, that you could never unsee it. It was an image designed to be burned into the memory of everyone who watched, a warning that would be told and retold for generations. Second, the act was drenched in symbolism. To cut a person in two is the ultimate act of destruction. It's to literally and symbolically unmake them. For a traitor who tried to divide the kingdom, being divided himself was a form of sick, poetic justice. For a heretic who challenged the unity of the church, being split apart was a physical metaphor for their crime. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a message written in blood and bone. And finally, its real power was propaganda. The stories told about it were its greatest weapon. The lurid woodcuts, the tales of evil emperors, the myth of prolonged consciousness. These were the true instruments of terror. A king didn't need to saw people in half very often. He just needed everyone to believe he was capable of it, and that it was a slow, conscious, unimaginable torment. The legend became a tool of control, creating a level of fear that a simple hanging never could. The executioners weren't masters of anatomy, tricking the body into staying awake. They were masters of terror, staging a performance whose legend would do their work for them long after the blood had dried. The horror wasn't in keeping you alive, it was in making everyone else believe they did. The story of being sawn in half is a grim lesson in how history is made. It shows that our idea of the past is often shaped less by what actually happened and more by the stories we tell. The popular version of a clever trick to keep the victim awake is a terrifying tale, but it falls apart under a modern medical lens. The true horror of this punishment was a mix of things: the excruciating, though brief, pain of the act, the psychological terror of its symbolism, and above all, the incredible power of its own myth. Death by sawing was a brand. It was a story weaponized by governments and propagandists to create an image of absolute, terrifying power. The fear it created was always more widespread and more lasting than the punishment itself. It's a dark reminder that sometimes, the most effective tool of control isn't a saw blade, but the terrifying story you tell about it. If you found this dive into a dark corner of history compelling, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. We also want to hear from you. What other historical punishments or legends are you curious about? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.